This is The Lucky Exile, a podcast shining a light on the emerging movement of integrated healthcare through conversations with the professionals in and around the healthcare field. Listen in as we dig deeper into caring for the whole human, body, mind, and spirit. Welcome your host, licensed marriage and family therapist, Brenton Kirschner.
Welcome to the show. I'm Brenton Kirschner, and this is The Lucky Exile. Today, my guest is Ruth Culver, and she is a somatic psychotherapist based in Brighton, UK. She works with adults and teenagers in groups and individually, and has a particular interest in trauma, attachment, and resilience. She uses internal family systems as her model of psychotherapy, also known as IFS, and she often integrates this with other works and creative processes, such as her constellations and intuitive drawing. She created a graphic called the Survive, Thrive Spiral, which maps the Polyvagal Theory alongside internal family systems. And in 2020, this went viral and is now used by mental health professionals and individuals across the world. Ruth, we want to welcome you today and thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. I'm honored to be invited. I love your podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. One of the things I wanted to just throw out to you at first was, what are some differences that we might be seeing in the therapy world between the US and the UK? Like, I know a lot of things may be similar, but just for listeners that may be in the United States or outside of the UK, could you describe for us just a little bit about what attitudes about therapy are currently like in the UK?
Yeah, good question. I think a few years back, I probably would have said it's much more normal to be involved in therapy in the US, and that there's a lot less stigma around it. I'm familiar with American friends and colleagues in America who'd speak very openly about going to therapy, and that was not the case here at all. It was very secret. But that's really changing in recent years. There's been a quite sudden and marked emphasis on mental health, especially that's growing under COVID. We've got a lot of catching up to do. There's a massive backlog of people needing help with their mental health here. So, in recent years, it's really changed, and that has been the result of a few different campaigns, including the royal family. Obviously, Prince Harry was very instigational in that, his involvement in the military, the death of his mother, and he got, I think probably it was him who got his brother and King and Queen to be talking about mental health in a national campaign. Extraordinary. So that's made it more acceptable in the UK. There's more awareness, but it's really just a bit of an epidemic here, to be honest. So people have had to wake up to it. But we're a long, long way behind it being a normal thing to take care of your mental health in the way that you would your physical health, I would say.
Well, and we can definitely relate to that too in the United States. While I do think you're right, like there are some good movements kind of with the same thing of it being okay to say, hey, we all have mental health issues that we're working on. Life can be challenging and hard. That doesn't mean something negative or bad about my value or who I am. There are still so many different cultures and different pockets that are at various stages, throughout our culture too, where there still is that stigma. And I think that's something, like you said, that's so powerful is when somebody steps up and says, hey, I struggled with this and it's okay. And here's kind of that road forward. It gives others that permission to say that. So I think that's so neat that the royal family is doing that and leading with that example. I think that's a really great thing for leaders to consider, especially in our culture too, of like how they can set an example for others. Now, something cool too, I noticed that I wanted to hear just a little bit about as well is from looking at your website, you've had some experience doing a couple different things, from working with charity, with art, with being a jazz singer as well. Like you've had some really cool experiences even before you jumped into the world of therapy as well. And also I think you even worked with a prison service too, right? Helping out with a prison service.
I did, yeah. I spent 25 years in event management, basically for arts and charities, media, radio and TV. And I'd always been drawn to working in sort of some kind of socially responsible, some kind of work that made a contribution. So, yeah, working in prisons was pretty interesting. I had some amazing experiences. And my job was really to persuade the mainstream that we need to focus on getting ex-prisoners into employment, because if nobody will employ them, if they don't get a chance at a new life, what choices do they have?
And one thing I really love with kind of your heart here is you very much so seem to be an advocate for saying, hey, people need compassion, care. They need a chance. They need to be understood. Just labeling someone as bad or labeling somebody as just kind of a castaway or an exile, if we're borrowing internal family systems language from society, that never leads to healing. And so, I can think about some of my background and training was in this concept of once I really know somebody's story, maybe I would have made different choices, but ultimately I probably would have struggled very similarly to how they did. If I had gone through their context, if I had really been in their shoes, I could see how I could have gotten to the same place. And that's not justifying behaviors in some way that are inappropriate or need to change, but it is saying it's human to struggle. And the way out of that struggle is this advocacy of caring, of making room for, of healing, of providing that good path forward. And so I love with how that kind of filters into internal family systems too, and the compassion on all parts being welcome as well. I'm curious, whenever you got into therapy, what kind of led to that transition and got you passionate about saying, okay, I want to jump into the world of therapy. I want to start providing this as a psychotherapist?
Yeah, what happened was I burned out. I was a perfectionist. I was a workaholic. I kept going. I kept driving myself, and my health started to fail, and I just had to stop. So yeah, although I loved my job in the arts and charities and things, I was doing 2 people's or 3 people's jobs because there was never enough money. Didn't really know about self-care. Was probably not probably. I was very dissociated. I had no idea about my own needs. And so, yeah, as a result, I burned out. I had to stop. And I started looking for what would help me because I didn't want to become a sort of permanently sick person. And I realized that the mind and body were just inextricable. You couldn't just treat a physical illness through medicine or a mental illness through the mind, for that matter. The two are completely hand in hand. So I got really fascinated about approaches that were embodied. When I first encountered therapy, counseling, that kind of thing, I found it very uncomfortable. I think depending on how your own parts in your system are responding, for me, that kind of apparently compassionate, that empathetic head on one side type of counseling, which you're hearing in my voice, is, oh, you poor thing, that didn't help me. It gave me no hope, no help, just stuck with the feelings I was having. And similarly, the very blank sort of traditional psychotherapy where you don't get anything back. I got no help. I got stuck with my feelings. So it was only when I found things like hypnotherapy, which is where hypnotherapy, NLP, which allowed us to put the mind and body together, that I began to realize, this makes total sense. You can imagine simply a plate of your favorite food and start salivating. The mind and body they're one.
I can relate to that as well, as I don't want somebody to feel sorry for me or look down at me. At the same time, I don't want somebody to be so fact-based that I feel like I'm more talking to, my accountant than a therapist at the same time. But hypnotherapy, yeah, I mean, that is one of those amazing things too, with how that relates with even with internal family systems as well, with guided imagery. But hypnotherapy is its own kind of specialty as well. And so maybe something that I'd be curious about, if you don't mind going into, is talking a little bit about how you use these 3 things that we're talking about: hypnotherapy, internal family systems, the Polyvagal Theory, how you kind of use those with clients to help them in your approach, and any other approaches as well that you use in your practice. I would love to hear that.
Well, I don't use hypnotherapy at all now. That was my first major training, and that's how I practiced for a long time. But I became aware that although it was very effective, it didn't, in IFS terms, in terms of internal family systems, it allows you to go straight to the exiles, but the protectors may not give their permission, so you can get backlash. You get abreactions, you get people for whom it worked brilliantly, but for other people it didn't. So I got very interested in trauma and the nervous system. So that's where I kind of led into the polyvagal. And then I found IFS about the same time. And I trained in a form of constellations, which works with internal parts as well. And that, again, I'd found fantastic. And yet the people were being re-traumatized because it went too strong, too fast, too deep. So when I found IFS, it was like, wow, fantastic. This is amazing. This is what I've sort of been trying to do, to put together the inner child work from hypnotherapy and the constellations work of working with parts, with groups, but without doing too much because of the polyvagal I understood and all the trauma study I've been doing. And here it was in this beautiful package of IFS. So I didn't have to reinvent the wheel, and I'm incredibly grateful to have found it. So that's basically what I do now. I do IFS, and I call it polyvagal informed. Sometimes the knowledge of polyvagal theory is just in me. It's just making me aware of what's happening in my own body, aware of how I tune into the client, which we did in hypnotherapy a lot. You know, you watch people's skin color or the tearing up of their eyes or flushes or twitches. You watch all that, but there's much more information from polyvagal and understanding of that. And then because in this graphic I've created, I've mapped the two together, we start to see how different protectors are operating kind of almost within different parts of the nervous system. And this beautiful understanding that the exiles are kind of trapped between the fight, flight, and the freeze sections. They're kept there by the protectors for their own safety, and yet that means that they can't heal. So that's why we have to go to the protectors first, get them to calm down, just take a pause, and then we can very safely go to the exiles and bring them down towards this area of resilience where there is self-connection. The protectors are still doing their job, but in a very relaxed way as part of a team rather than taking over. So it's that kind of approach. And so I will use it very directly with some clients. I'll show them the graphic or talk to them. You know, we do different mappings. And for some people, especially those who are very analytical, it can be a great relief to understand the science, that there is science behind it. Oh, that's why I do this particular activity. You know, I now get it in polyvagal terms. So it's de-shaming. It can be a lovely way into the body because you've got the facts there right now, that the analytical part, maybe just take a step aside, maybe watch, have a little listen whilst we investigate some of the more somatic stuff.
One thing that I really like that you mentioned that's in, I see a lot in my practice too, is that when I explain internal family systems, for those that are more analytical, this idea of different parts of myself, sometimes that can be a little bit hard to accept as a new idea or a worldview. But you're right. Like, I feel like for those individuals, combining it with something like the polyvagal theory and saying, hey, here's what we know about what's going on in the body. Here's kind of what we've seen from research. And when I say a manager and we talk about like that almost flight or fight response, if I stay so busy with work that I'm staying ahead of the train, I'm staying ahead of my feelings. When I say manager, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about this part of you that's learned it can keep you safe by doing all this good stuff at work. You're successful in that. But that sadness you're running from, that feeling of grief and loss, you always get to stay a couple steps ahead of it because of that. The cost to you is you never get to feel joy, relaxation, peace. You never get to actually see the meaningful parts that grief can bring. While it's an unpleasant emotion, to say the least, it doesn't mean it's without meaning. It's got an important life lesson for us as well. And yeah, I love that combination that you're saying of how you can use them to kind of help each other out. And yet internal family systems provide such a more intimate understanding of ourselves. Not that the polyvagal theory lacks, but I think internal family systems gives us a language and a relationship between these parts and their interactions. And so now I can say to this part of myself, instead of having this anger towards this part of myself, I can say, you've been trying to take care of me. So that behavior I wish I could stop, or I wish I never did anymore, and maybe I have resentment or shame towards that part of myself, I can now look in with compassion and say, while I still maybe want that behavior to change, I understand you came up with a solution to an unsolvable problem, and I can have gratitude. And I love you really said that when you said the parts start to work together instead of kind of being adversarial or feeling that they've got to dominate one another. And that's where we see a lot of that healing taking place. So the intuitive drawing is another big part of your practice. Can you tell us a little bit about What is intuitive drawing? What does that look like for clients?
Yeah, there's quite a movement in IFS of drawing parts, but I'm not working that way. I'm working with just mark making. And so this came about through, I was doing sand tray work I used to do a lot of externalization, especially with people, where the system feels very overwhelmed. Going inside feels too much for them. It's much safer to work outside. So working with sand tray, and sometimes if I didn't have that, we might just use crayons and paper. And instead of trying to do a pretty drawing, because of course people always say I'm no good at drawing, I just say, just grab a color. And then, what's the energy of that part? And so if it was an angry part, they might cover the whole sheet in some red scribbles. Or if it was a little exile who is feeling unseen, it might be the tiniest little dot in the corner of the paper. And so it's an unblending technique by putting it on the paper. It also builds compassion where you see this little tiny dot. So I'm starting to build up kind of constellations effectively as people are working through their parts onto the paper. And it grew more and more working one-to-one as a way to work. Some people loved it. I did use different techniques with different clients, but a lot of people really loved this one. And then when we got to COVID, I was running these IFS constellations workshops because I'd put the constellations process with IFS together. I kind of completely fused them so that you're doing IFS but in a group, resonating. So using the resonating process of constellations, whereby you kind of feel stuff that you don't even know where it's coming from. This sixth sense that we have, we would pick things up, and then working with one client at a time to map their own system and come into contact with protectors and exiles within the constellations. And of course, COVID meant I could no longer do that. And I wanted to carry on working with groups. And I just didn't feel that I could do this very delicate nervous system work on Zoom because I want to see people's whole bodies, I just couldn't do it with just their faces in a group. So I tried it out to do this intuitive drawing process with a group. And I now have a small group process. There are 8 people. We work across 8 weeks. And each week there's a different intuitive drawing process. We might be looking at the inner critic. We might be looking at a polarity. We might be looking at somatic symptoms. We might be looking at the nervous system. We might be looking at a particular exile. So different things. Each one has a kind of guided drawing process, and then they share with each other. So there's a kind of community building aspect. There's co-regulation, nice ventral vagal co-regulation when people come into twos. And then in each week, I'll also do a one-to-one. So each of those 8 people each week will have a one-to-one session. And in that, they have a full IFS session complete with witnessing, unburdening, unblending, redos, all sorts of things happen. But we discover and explore the parts through this intuitive drawing. And you never know what's going to come up, because somebody might think that it's a part that feels a particular way, but when they grab the color and they put it on the paper, something else may arrive, and often it's hidden parts that they didn't know were there. It's really beautiful.
I think one of the things too that's cool about that is that it stays out of the headspace more too. Like I've seen a lot of the drawings, and I think those are great. However, if I'm really starting to think about what do I want my manager to look like, and what could that mean? A accidental, side effect may be I'm starting to come out of my body and I'm getting back into my head and analyzing, which is great, except for our purpose is trying to really stay in that experiential realm. And so I love what you're doing with keeping it to where it can be that abstract. There's not as much of a box on, well, you need to draw out your manager. It needs to look like this. It's saying, yeah, just pick a color. Let's see what happens. And I mean, intuitive describes it well. But then as a client, I can really stay in the experiential. I don't have to be pulled out of that process then.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's one of the beauties of it, that it brings you out of the headspace, but also it increases the information that comes from the body. So somebody may draw something, and just because they're being driven by the heat that's coming through their body, or they're in a kind of very much a trance state. I mean, this is we know when we do IFS, we are in a trance. So they just draw it intuitively, and all of a sudden they see that the anger, for example, which might be a red, a big red blob, around it has got all this green circle all the way around it, and it's a manager that's keeping that anger completely trapped and can't be expressed. And then you get to discover the relationship between the two, the manager that's keeping that firefighter a protector in exile. So you can start to find out things. And there was another drawing, an amazing one I experienced, where there was a guy working with a part that was terrified, and he drew it, and it was very tiny. And I asked him if this part was aware of what was around it. And he basically drew a big sort of pinky red shape. And then I won't go into the anatomical details, but it was very clearly a womb. And I asked him to ask the part how long he'd felt this way. And this part said, forever. And I said, was there ever a time before you knew this? And he said, no, never. It's been there. So then I asked him a little bit about his mother when she was pregnant. And then he was able to access that she'd been depressed and stressed. And he really understood, because his body had produced the information. He trusted that it had been there right from the beginning. It was transformational for him.
And that healing right there, and the permission it probably gave him too, to be able to say it's always been there, and then to access that information, right? Like, okay, if mom was going through this and struggling with that time, that probably made it hard for me to find that attachment. Instead of just feeling that negativity towards myself, now I'm seeing this negativity or shame is actually just unmet needs. And I can start getting to those. And again, I love that transformational process. It's such a neat thing how it's a subtle and gentle change, but its impact is huge. So that's a beautiful piece with it there too. You mentioned this combination that you're doing between group and individual, which I really like. And I was just wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about some of the advantages of having people do internal family systems with a group. A lot of people do internal family systems one-on-one with a therapist, and that's great. But combining it with group work as well, I think there's a big thing to that. And so what do you normally see with the advantage for clients as they get to jump into some of this work within the group?
Yeah, it's different for everybody. For some people, they feel safer to come to a group in the first place. It feels like they, maybe can hide a little bit. For other people, to get to a point where they can go into a group is a real sign that they've done enough one-to-one work that they feel safe to go into a group. The group allows them to be witnessed by many more people. So it's a very de-shaming. Oh, I'm not the only one with all this stuff. It also means that they get to know a lot of the managers who are keeping them from speaking up in a group, or who make them dominate in a group, or who keep them hidden, so terrified that they can't share. We have a kind of, social media sharing place as well. Those who can share, those who can't share. So we're always working in process in the group with everything that's happening at each point. But whereas my personal experience of group therapy when I was much younger was really violent, people could sit in this circle and just abuse each other. This is completely different because it's compassion-based. Nobody is talking about anybody else. They're just talking about their own parts. And the level of connection, the level of safety, by the time we get to the 8 weeks, there's all that ventral vagal co-regulation that's going on that's way more possible than with me. And then, of course, because they're peers, rather than it's not a therapist-to-client relationship, of course I'm there as well, but it's a peer-to-peer relationship. So that makes them feel much more, often people feel stronger, more able to do things on their own, because I'm not so reliant on my therapist for doing everything for me. I know IFS has a great inbuilt way of avoiding that, but it is there still. So I'm gradually building a bit of a community around this. People who have done the 8-week course, now we've got a monthly community group meeting where we kind of do some catch-ups and people buddy up. I've had people do kind of 30-day challenges where they draw every day and share them on social media, or maybe once a week they check in, they buddy up. We also do a lot with co-listening. There's a whole movement in co-listening. So I kind of really try and guide them to speak for their parts and just listen, just give that amazing gift of listening rather than having to fix. Notice your own parts as they come up. And so there's that benefit as well, because of course they're learning to listen to each other in this way, which benefits their kids because they're getting to listen to their kids' parts, or just listen to their kids talking rather than trying to fix it, noticing their own parts coming in to fix or push away or minimize or find a solution or whatever. Yeah, so many benefits of the group. Plus I get to work with more people at once.
Yes. And I think one of those things too that's a big benefit is that peer-to-peer relationship you mentioned, because you're right. Like with the therapist, sometimes in the therapeutic relationship, I don't get a chance maybe as a client to feel that witnessing from somebody that I feel like is more like in that process with me in the sense of they're currently learning it and going through it too. And I think there's something to be said. I need both. I need somebody that I feel like can be that guide or that jump start till my true self can really, step up to the plate. And like you said, with internal family systems, the idea being that it's not the therapist that is going to lead the system, but that client's true self. And that's such a beautiful thing to, avoid dependence and it be more about that client feeling empowered to be able to lead their system, which is the ultimate goal anyways. But it's such an elegant solution you've come up with there because you've found a way through the groups also to build this community. And I think one thing I've heard from clients before is sometimes when they conclude their therapy or pause their therapy, they may step away and they've had this experience individually with the therapist that they would love to share with others. But it's been such a big experience that it's like, who am I going to find that can listen to psychoeducation on internal family systems and then hear my whole story and hear my parts and everything? And there's this sense of loneliness that sometimes I think clients feel of like, I've just had this amazing life experience of getting to know myself. And yet now I feel like it's such a journey to ever get to share that. So in group work or this community that you're building outside of group work, it fulfills that need, it sounds like, because now not only did I have others witness those parts, but I've got this continued community I can continue to share that with, lean on, learn from. And I think that that's fulfilling such a need that could be so easy to overlook is we need that. We need people to be able to hear our story and understand it. The other thing too that jumped out to me is the developmental part of it. I was talking with just the other day with a developmental psychologist, and she was telling me about how a lot of times we learn skills and stuff by watching others. You see that with babies. They watch other babies and they learn how to solve problems. And I'm wondering if that would be true for group work and community as well, as maybe I see somebody else do something compassionate with their parts and they're not preaching it to me. Like you said, they're not trying to criticize my parts or anything. They're just working on theirs, but I get to observe that. And that puts some of the dots in for me. So it's also turning up the speed and efficiency on treatment because now everybody's kind of collectively learning and working together and sharing that knowledge.
Yeah, very much so. By observing the individual, the one-to-one processes each week, people are doing their own work. They often describe it as a parallel process. On one level, they are observing and compassionate towards the person working. And on another, all sorts of stuff is being activated within them when they've got similar parts. They might end up kind of with one hand, almost they're like drawing their own stuff so that gets witnessed. They're witnessing their own part that's the similar, whilst they're witnessing the person who's working. And big shifts can happen just by observing, by being present to someone else's process. And I learned that really from the constellations work, which is why it's so wonderful to be able to do it in a group with IFS.
Are you seeing whether within your own practice or maybe the next steps when you're thinking about larger issues going on for the UK, where would you like to see some of this work with internal family systems spread from a community basis? Do you have any hopes or goals? And again, either your own practice or just for the larger community itself?
Well, I'm very encouraged by what the Institute's doing in the States, taking it into businesses and schools. And I think that can't come quick enough, really. I'm actually working with a charity, a mental health forum in West London. They've asked me to take my work in to do some workshops with people who provide mental health care in extreme distress, where they're using restraint a lot. So it's a very difficult area. And of course, when they've been committed, when they've been restrained, they can almost be dehumanized. It's the absolute opposite of what we need. So bringing an IFS approach to that if someone's got a part that's freaking out or trying to bang the door down or whatever, let's get curious about what's the positive intention of that part. I mean, wow, wouldn't that make the most amazing difference in mental health institutions? So I've got a big passion for where that work might go in the future.
Absolutely. And I love that you bring that up because it jumps back to our first point about this stigma, in either of our cultures where I'm afraid. And some of that fear is based on good reason, because historically, with issues that were not understood well, or maybe we didn't have a good treatment option with. Yeah, things have been done to lose the trust, I think, of patients and the public. And things have come so far since then, right? We know so much more about trauma, about PTSD, about how even a lot of different things, and this is, included in your diagram that you made, about how certain diagnosis can be confused with parts that may be polarized. So we look at a list of symptoms and we may say ADHD. We might say, eating disorder. We might say schizophrenia. And yes, certainly there's always going to be a percent of the population that is struggling with true organic or, structurally based issues. And I think one thing, though, that's happened is sometimes because we haven't looked at that person's story in context enough, we may have missed that this was a contextual issue that might present similar symptoms, but is not organically based. And it's amazing how their diagnosis seems to almost disappear as they receive what they really need and that treatment they need. So instead of always just going back to that pathologizing model, I feel like a lot of this more polyvagal informed internal family systems approach that you're talking about says, hey, that's always there if we need to, but that can be a last resort. Why don't we first see what's going on with these parts? Maybe these exaggerated emotions, experiences actually have a backstory. And it's amazing what exploring that backstory and meeting those needs could actually change, that maybe before we were assuming couldn't be changed, needs to just, result in, that more pathologizing type treatment.
Yeah, I tend to shock some of the teachers at schools I talk to, when I have these teenagers who are maybe cutting and I just go, I'm not really worried about the cutting. I'm worried about what's making her cut. That's what I'm talking to her about. And yeah, but we've got to stop her. That's just not the way I work. That's not my treatment. And educating them in this approach, which of course Gabor Mate is doing an amazing job of getting people to understand that it's not the addiction, it's the cause of it. But that job of educating people, bringing them up to speed and how we understand these symptoms, it's more than therapists alone can do. It's got to be bigger than that somehow. So I'm really happy that, some of these, Richard Schwartz is appearing on some of these really big podcasts, and people are really starting to understand, and Gabor Mate as well, people starting to understand that's what's going on, really.
And that change, you're right, it has to happen at a bigger level because, even you mentioned that type of experience when you're trying to work with, a teacher or somebody in society on, going back to the prison systems. It might be even understanding me as the teacher, me as the person in charge of this area in the community. I've got my own managers and firefighters. And what we do with a community around individuals that are struggling, do we exile them? Because there's almost this meta perspective then of internal family systems of, there's parts of the community that represent those managers, firefighters, and the exiles. And I do think that that's something that we've really struggled with in our culture is when people are struggling, whether it be addiction, trauma, something with their mental health, at least I can speak for US culture, we are almost allergic to suffering and to loss and death. We're very afraid of it. And so we stiff arm it as much as we can to keep it away. But in doing so, internal family systems would kind of help, compassionately say, you can do that. But it unfortunately will only lead to your own detriment and societal issues as well, where we see that happening. We see a lot of issues that pop up in society are saying this was at one time a group that was exiled, or, that we just said, we don't want to look at that feeling or this reality. And so I love that you're mentioning that there has to be a bigger societal change around it too, where we're thinking what that can look like as well. I think I also wanted to check in. Were there any other topics too that you wanted to get to today? I want to make sure we cover some of the things you wanted to get to. Anything else jumping out on your mind?
Yeah, so there was a client I worked with a little while back, and she had suffered a sort of really big collapse. You'd call it a nervous breakdown. And so, of course, her psychiatrist was giving her a lot of medications, and she was feeling really bad on them, feeling really awful on them. Very inspired by Frank Anderson, who was saying, I don't give anybody any medications until we've checked that all the parts are willing to take them. So I talked to her psychiatrist a little bit about this, and he said, okay, that's interesting. But he kept prescribing without talking to me. So she would turn up to her sessions having been given something new, and I didn't know what I was working with. But when I was able to work out what was going on and keep going back to him, and I sent him some information about Frank and some of his articles and things, finally got him to talk to me and let me know when he was changing medications. And so then to slow down what he was doing, instead of this, right, prescription, take the drug, it's okay, here's a piece of paper, here are the indications of it. And then there was a pause whilst we got to talk to her system, talk to the parts that were really welcoming of the numbing, and then other parts for whom the numbing was unbearable because it meant the exiles were never going to get heard. If she was in a sort of daze the whole time, this exile was just going to have to work harder. So as we worked towards getting a dosage that meant that she was not numbed out, she was able to feel, but not overwhelmed by the feeling, with the permission of her protectors, she's starting to heal. It's a long journey, but starting to heal in a completely different way. And her psychiatrist is quite shocked. He'd never done that before. So that's exciting.
That's something I've seen as well, where sometimes I'm almost felt like sometimes psycho medications can be almost used as a tool for those protector parts to keep the exile in check, and which is counterproductive to healing. And so it's almost like handing the manager something that they can do to take the microphone away from the exile, to make it disappear again. And while it might provide that temporary relief, we haven't done our client or patient any long-term good because they're further from that healing process happening. And yeah, sometimes there's crisis management, or there may be things, but what you're saying is so important, and it happens so often, is you're working with the system, you're trying to get them into their body. At the same time, a different professional is one side effect of that that's not intentional, but it taking them further away from that, plus making it so hard for the therapist to distinguish what is their exile, what is the medication, how do I sort those out? And it kind of brings me to the thought about team-based medicine. And I know one of the challenges, again, here in the US is finding funding for it. It seems to be going really well with pediatric care and children's hospitals. They're able to, in the US, to find funding where they get a multidisciplinary team together, and you're going to have all sorts of different professionals with specialties meeting in one room, or, doing these meetings over Zoom or different things like that to communicate with each other on what the plan for that one patient's going to be. But a lot of places, at least here, with adult care, they can't find the funding to get all those professionals working together on that. And so a lot of times here, at least, it seemed that the communication between professionals sounds a lot like what you had to do, where you had to get this conversation going and saying, hey, let's collaborate, let's work together. Otherwise, something's going to get missed in the communication. It's almost like two people building, opposite sides of a bridge without checking with each other on what they're going to do when they meet in the middle. It could be disastrous. But do you find, for you guys in the UK, what's the current attitude towards team-based medicine or that communication between professionals?
I think it doesn't really happen very much. If somebody's in an institution or under a certain body of care, then that may happen as a matter of course. But once you're out into the private sector, where somebody's individually paying their therapist, individually paying their psychiatrist, etc., or neurofeedback person, it takes them to talk to each other. And of course, it takes the client to ask it. And then you have to work out the difference between the clients who are asking it because they're aware that their parts might be being overridden, as you said, that manager who is very happy to get numbed out with some drugs, and so is running the. So it takes the awareness of the client to realize that's happening in their system, or maybe the IFS therapist to maybe get them to the point where they can understand that might be happening or discuss it. But then nobody's funding it. It's up to individuals to do it. And of course, then is it the kind of client who perhaps might have a manager who's more than delighted to have everybody doing lots of unpaid work on their behalf, because that might be feeding a part that needs, maybe a narcissistically wounded part that needs to be seen, or who's running the show. So it is a complex issue.
Yeah, I feel like that hopefully will be a growth area, as medicine continues to evolve for both mental health and physical, is saying, how do we fill that gap in a way that's sustainable? I realize there are limitations, that we work in the world, but it's a huge need because, I see a lot of treatment outcomes being greatly impacted, either in a positive or negative direction based on that communication, based on that teamwork. And it is so much is so highly specialized. I mean, if you were going to think about everything, that maybe somebody who has gone to school to become a psychiatrist may have obtained versus a psychotherapist or specializing in trauma or internal family systems, they each have this very well-defined niche that they're trying to work from. And so to try to just get all that communication shared between them is no small deal, because it's saying, hey, these two things inform each other. So hopefully we can see more changes with that. And I know that's the thing we keep coming back to in this podcast from each guest says, we want to see more team-based medicine. We want to see more collaboration. And so I definitely think there's a big need for it. Any other thoughts with medication that jumped out to you? And some of these examples you're throwing out have been really helpful as well, or just any other things you wanted to jump into today?
There's nothing left on my list. I can talk the hand leg off a donkey, Brenton. But
I've enjoyed this, though, and it's so helpful. And so, when we're looking through some of the big things here, there's so much to be understood by letting go of shame and stigma and saying, hey, life is challenging. My mental health is just like my physical health. It's worth taking care of. There's so many different approaches that we can take, but we're really finding that internal family systems has been one that I see a lot of providers coming back to, is saying it just works. It just matches naturally with people. And, you mentioned some of the groups and the individual therapy you're offering. Definitely want to share that with people right now. One of the questions I had is that only available in the UK? Are people outside of the UK ever able to sign up for your groups?
Yeah, I have people from all over the world come to my groups. The problem is I just can't offer enough. They sell out in 24 hours. So I would love to offer more, but I think someone's asked me to write a book. So I might write a book, and I might, I have a real whole posse of imposter parts going, what are you talking about? Offer a training course to therapists? You've only been doing IFS for a few years. What are you talking about? But I keep being asked, and lots of therapists come and take part in the groups, and they want it. So maybe I'll be doing that soon.
Well, I can definitely see why, just from speaking with you today. And, maybe while some of the languaging or training may have been a few years, I mean, just hearing a little bit about your background and story, I think you clearly have had a skill and a heart for this work long before you even became a therapist. So, it sounds like there's a lot of great experience in that you have to offer. I definitely want to encourage people to reach out and look at Ruth's website. You can find it at calmheart.co.uk. She's got a lot of great things on her website, from her resource that just went viral again on the polyvagal and internal family systems, to as well as information about her retreats, her workshops, the kind of work she does, frequently asked questions. I mean, all sorts of great things that you can find there. Definitely want to encourage you to look her up and be watching out for a possible book. I would be excited to hear about that as well. We'll have to try to rope you back into coming on the show to share that for sure if that comes to pass. But Ruth, I just want to thank you again for your time and coming on the show. And again, your compassion, your expertise towards contributing to the field and patients out there as well.
Oh, well, thank you so much for inviting me to come and just chatting about IFS and polyvagal theory, and feeling part of this community of how much we love this work and how much we want it to be the change that we know it can be in the world, and keep spreading it. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to The Lucky Exile with Brenton Kirschner. We're so glad you've joined us. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching The Lucky Exile. To learn more about Brenton, his practice, and ways integrative healthcare can help you or a loved one, visit BrentonKirschner.com. We encourage you to like, share, and subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode. Until next time, be well.